I wanted to look at some things having to do with faith tonight, because there's some things in this chapter in John 7 that aren't necessarily what the chapter is about per se. And Judah covered that for us and went through those verses. But these things about faith, I think, are important and they speak to us. So I wanted to talk tonight specifically about that and some things having to do with these verses. I also really like this picture of this child near the top of this ladder reaching up toward God. Because isn't that what faith is about? And aren't we all children before God? And so I really thought that picture speaks of what we're talking about tonight. Well, in John 7, 1 and 2, it says, "After these things, Yeshua was walking in Galilee, for he wouldn't walk in Judea because the Judeans sought to kill him. Now the Jewish festival, the Feast of Sukkot, was at hand." There's a few things that I'd like to look into before we get more into this question about faith. They are, it says, after these things this happened. What things was it talking about? And when did this fall in Yeshua's ministry? We want to talk about timing. And what was the big concern at that time on Yeshua's mind? So let's see if we can determine those things. In John 6, I'm sure you remember the things that happened. These are the things that it means when it's saying after these things. It's these things that are in John 6. And as you remember, Yeshua fed the 5,000. It was really more than 5,000, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Kind of a big thing, right? And Yeshua walked on the water. That was a really big thing. And then after this, we have quite a long section there where many are stumbled by Yeshua's words and turn away. And certainly this does touch on faith a lot, because these people saw these amazing things, particularly Yeshua feeding the multitude, and yet they're asking for a sign. And when Yeshua speaks the truth to them, a hard truth, even many of his disciples turned away. And so if there's a lesson here about faith, it's that most people end up being stumbled. Most people that are confronted with the truth, though some of them will walk with it for a period of time, lose faith and turn away. And that's really a pretty big thing to see that happen. And another thing that happened is that after that, and many turned away, Peter confessed his faith on behalf of those disciples, meaning the apostles, saying, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." So they believed, despite those that turned away. That's a pretty big thing, because a lot of times, unfortunately, we're too affected by what the majority of people do. You know, human beings are social creatures, and if it seems like most of the people are going in a certain direction, most folks follow the crowd when that happens. And so for Peter and those other apostles to stick with the Messiah because they believed in him was something that was real, something that meant something. So I think that's an important point. So those are the things that it's talking about when it says after what things. It's these things. Now, here's something I wanted to point out to you, that Matthew chapter 16 seems to parallel this same general time period, because it mentions these same events. For instance, in verse 9 there in Matthew 16, there's an argument over bread, and bread is a big issue in John chapter 6. and they're having an argument over bread. And then Yeshua mentions the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and the baskets that were taken up. So this was a fresh event that he's mentioning. And then also in Matthew 16, we have Simon Peter confessing, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." Even exactly the same words that we find in John 6. So this indicates that we're talking about the same general time period of these 2 chapters. This becomes important because Matthew 16 has a lot of material in it that's not in John 6. And John 6 has a lot of material in it that's not in Matthew 16. So by looking at both of these chapters together that happened during the same general time period, we get a bigger picture of what was happening at that time. So our next question is, when did this fall in Yeshua's ministry? Well, at the beginning of John 6, it says, "Now the Passover, the Jewish festival, was at hand." So it was just before the Passover. And as we've been going through the book of John, we've been counting the Passovers. This would be the 3rd Passover that it's talking about at the beginning of John 6. Now when we get to John 7, it says, "Now the Jewish festival, the Feast of Sukkot, was at hand." And as we know, Sukkot falls 6 months later than Passover. And since, according to the chronology in John as we go along, this would be Yeshua's last Sukkot of his ministry, it could be no other than that one. And so we're talking here, when we're talking about after these things, the things it's talking about are the things that happened during roughly the 6-month period from Passover to Sukkot. And we even know what year it is because of Bible chronology. We know when this particular year would be, being the 3rd Passover and then the Sukkot. This would be around Sukkot of 32 AD. So we can narrow this time down pretty close. Let's see what else we can find out. What was the big concern going on right at that time? Well, 7 verse 1 mentions this concern, even though in John 6 it didn't really talk about it much. But it says, "After these things, Yeshua was walking in Galilee, for he wouldn't walk in Judea because the Judeans sought to kill him." So in John, it's just setting it forth as a fact without giving all the backstory. I think the reason for that is because the backstory is in other places like Matthew chapter 16, and that had already been written, and so it didn't need to be repeated. So let's look at Matthew 16 and see if it speaks to this issue at all. As you read through Matthew 16, you get to Peter's confession, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." And then it's narrated after that happens. It says, "From that time, Yeshua began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and the 3rd day be raised up." So what we see here, it was right during this time, just before John 7 starts, that Yeshua started telling his disciples, essentially, there's a plot to kill me, and it's going to happen. They're going to kill me, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead on the 3rd day. That's what he started to tell them. So clearly, this was a big thing on his mind, and it was a big thing on their minds. So from the information we have so far, we want to ask the question, did Yeshua's disciples believe in him? And of course, John 6:69 says, we have come to believe and know that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim. And considering so many had left and they stayed, we have to accept this confession as a real confession of what they believed. They believed that he was the Messiah and the Son of Elohim. And yet, we ask the question, did Yeshua's disciples believe there was a plot by the religious leaders to kill him, that they would succeed, and that Yeshua would be raised from the dead? And the answer is clearly no, they didn't believe that. Now, right away, when I see that, my head goes like that. Because so many people think that belief or faith is monolithic. It's like a big rock in the middle of the room. It is what it is. But belief doesn't work like that for people. Belief doesn't work like that. You can come to believe in Yeshua as the Messiah and yet not believe everything he says. And you know what? I don't even want to say that to you, but I have to because it's true. It's what happened with his disciples. Because right after Yeshua said what he said to his disciples, told them what was going to happen, Peter took Yeshua aside, okay? Peter is taking Yeshua aside. The student is taking the master aside. And basically saying, you just made a big mistake. That'll never happen to you. That couldn't possibly happen to you. Did Peter believe it? Clearly, Peter did not believe it. And I think the reason he didn't believe it is because the fact was so clear to him that Yeshua is the Messiah and is the Son of God, that it's unthinkable that these things could happen to the Messiah and the Son of God. So because of that, he doesn't believe what the Messiah just said to him. Is that logical? People aren't logical. I'm sure that's not a big news flash, is it? Okay. How long did this unbelief in the plot to kill Yeshua and in his resurrection thereafter last with the disciples? Well, we're going to follow this as we go through the book of John, but here's one place. We're in John 6 right now. We're moving ahead now to John 16. A lot's happened by the time you get to John 16. And without going into all the details, because we'll do that when we get there, his disciples said to him, "Behold, now you speak plainly and speak no figures of speech. Now we know that you know all things and don't need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you came forth from Elohim." Yeshua answered them, "Do you now believe?" They did believe, but you know what? Their belief was iffy. And just now they're getting to the place of saying, oh, you don't need anybody to question you. So obviously, up to now, they weren't totally on board with his program, right? They believed who he was, but they weren't believing everything he was saying. And so they continued to be questioning him, and now they say they believe, but then Yeshua says, "Do you now believe?" And then he goes on and tells them, "You will be scattered, everyone to his own place. You will leave me alone." So their belief, though real, was far from perfect faith. Far from perfect faith. And then, amazingly, in the very last chapter of Matthew, the resurrected Yeshua Messiah is appearing to the 11 disciples, and it tells us some doubted. Doubted. Doubts. They had doubts. Yeshua Messiah, the resurrected Yeshua Messiah, holds in his hands and feet, scar in his side, hem in his body is standing in front of them, and yet some doubted. Is this really that shocking? Do you have perfect faith? You read the Bible, you read the same word that I read. And if you've been moving along with us here at Zion for any length of time, you've read a lot of verses that talk about the second Exodus, that say it's going to happen, that the remnant out of all the nations are going to be drawn out of all those nations and are going home in the remnant Exodus. Do you believe it? A lot of people have doubts. A lot of people say, well, you know, when you're ready to go, give me a call. I'm not going to, by the way. I'm not going to call you. Not like that. Not if you just disappear and do your own thing, and then if it happens, you want me to call you. I'm not sure that those are the people that Yeshua wants to bring home in the second Exodus. What do you think? That's a lot like the people in the first Exodus, isn't it? And how did that work out for that generation? So really, on the one hand, we look at this and we say, oh, this is really something that the disciples doubted and all of that. This is what's normal. I'm not saying it's what's right or good. I am telling you, with fallen human beings, this is what is normal. We just mentioned the whole generation that Yahweh took out of Egypt. What did they see? Right? The amazing 10 plagues that Yahweh brought on the gods of Egypt. They saw Yahweh with a strong hand deliver them. They saw the Red Sea parted. And they were delivered. And after that, time after time after time, they would not believe what Yahweh said. We must come to grips with this issue of doubts. Because doubting can cause the ruination of your life. If you think of what happened to that generation that came out of Egypt, that's a perfect example, right? Because they could have had this glorious testimony where they entered into the promised land, took the promised land as their own, had those homes to live in, had a wonderful life, and glorified Yahweh by what they did. And instead, because they doubted, they lost it all. And they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until they died. Were they Yahweh's people? They were. They were Yahweh's people. They knew Yahweh was real. But that's not the same, is it? As doing his will. So they missed out. So this is an issue. You know, the fact that people have doubts. On the one hand, we can expect people will have doubts. Some people will have doubts. But on the other hand, it's pretty scary. It's pretty scary as to what it can mean, and especially where we're at in the stream of time right now. Well, there's some more. Getting back to John 7:1, as we begin, Yeshua knew of the plot by the religious leaders of Judea to kill him and was avoiding them because it was not yet his time. Now, what was that like for Yeshua at that point in time? Because he knew it, but he seems to be the only one that believed that this was the situation. His disciples couldn't come to grips with that, and so they couldn't believe that was the case. What was he going to do? What would you do? What if you are a person and you know some life-changing fact, but everyone around you ignores that? Are you going to do what they want, or are you going to do what that fact calls for? A lot of us don't have that strength in ourselves where we will do the right thing against the opinion of others around us. And that's a challenge, and it's something we really need to think about. This is what Yeshua did. He knew this plot was a reality, and he had to deal with it accordingly, even though those around him, his closest men, were iffy about it, had doubts. Well, in John 7:2-4, we have Yeshua getting advice from his brothers. It says, "Now the Jewish festival, the feast of Sukkot, was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, 'Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see your works which you do. For no one does anything in secret, and himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, reveal yourself to the world.'" Is this advice a statement of belief or unbelief in Yeshua as the Messiah? Some people say that this is Yeshua's brothers mocking him. But to me, statements like "the works you do, reveal yourself to the world," are evidence to me that they believed in who he was. Just like the disciples, by the way, just like Peter confessed him as the Messiah, that they believed in him as who he was. But they had a different standing with him because they were his family. They were his brothers. And if you have brothers, sometimes your brothers can get a little pushy with you, telling you what you ought to do. And that seems to be what was happening here. Well, what else have we got here? Some facts about Yeshua's family. The biggest thing we find here in John chapter 2 is that Yeshua's family were involved in his ministry from its very beginning. His ministry began actively with his miracle at the marriage feast in Cana. And if you remember right, his mother basically launched that miracle. Right? She says to Yeshua, "Yeshua, they have no wine." She's expecting him to do something about it. Why would you think Yeshua's mother would be any different than your mother? Right? She's acting exactly like a mother. That's not a big surprise because Yeshua was part of a real family. Is there anything about that statement, though, that says she didn't believe in Yeshua? Or is it not exactly the opposite? Is it this very statement a statement of faith? Like, Yeshua, I know you're the Messiah and you can do something about this. Isn't that right? And you know what? As you read through the scriptures, you read through the prophets, what you're going to find is Yahweh loves it when people do this. For instance, what about Abraham challenging Yahweh and says, well, what if there's 10 righteous men in the city? Are you still going to destroy all those people? That's a statement of faith, not unbelief. That's a statement of a person who's in a real relationship with Yeshua, the pre-existent Yeshua, who feels free to speak his mind. Isn't that what it means in John chapter 4 when it says the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth? You don't have to be afraid to say the truth of how you really feel to Yeshua. And I will tell you this, if you're wrong, he'll tell you. He'll let you know. But he won't harm you because you have an opinion. Here, he set his mom straight about this. But the point is, his family was involved. Now, there in John 2, it goes on. It says, this is the beginning of his signs. It mentions that the signs revealed his glory. Glory as whom? The Messiah, the Son of God. It says his disciples believed in him. And then it says he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. Yeshua's ministry started with his family as a part of it. So obviously, they were not opposed to Yeshua, to his ministry, or what he was doing. They, in fact, were a part of it. They felt they had a personal stake in it. And they acted like a family, and they let him know what they thought. That's what families do. That's what healthy families do. Unhealthy families, whole different deal. A lot of times people don't even feel like they can talk in an unhealthy family. In healthy families, people can talk, share opinions, and get things sorted out. Well, after this, we have this comment, for even his brothers didn't believe in him. Well, some people really like to run down Yeshua's family. And this is one of the verses they like to point to. Oh, see that? His brothers didn't believe in him. Even though in the same book of John, over and over again, it's telling us that the disciples didn't believe in him. So somehow it's okay they didn't believe in him, but it's bad that Yeshua's brothers didn't believe in him. But in what sense did they not believe in him? Did they not believe that he was the Messiah? Well, look at Yeshua's answer. It says, Yeshua therefore said to them. So the word therefore means that Yeshua is responding in context to the situation. That's very important. Yeshua therefore said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world can't hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I'm not yet going up to this feast because my time is not yet fulfilled. Having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. So You notice in Yeshua's comments, there's zero about saying, well, you should believe that I'm the Messiah. You know, you don't believe that I'm the Son of God. It's not about that at all. Yeshua is talking about this issue having to do with going to the feast or not going to the feast. They didn't believe what Yeshua said about the plot, just like the disciples. And so they're telling him to do something different than what he knows he needs to do because he does know this plot is real. That's really the unbelief that it's talking about. So it's a limited thing. It's not believing something Yeshua said. Basically, what they were doing is sharing a strategy. And how I read this is they expected Yeshua to go up with them to the feast. And that's how it was normally done. You know, families normally went together to the feast, particularly the men. All the men were required by Scripture to go to the Feast of Sukkot. And so, no doubt, these brothers, along with Yeshua, had a history of going to Sukkot. So it probably feels really strange that Yeshua is saying, I'm not going to Sukkot with you. Kind of a little disagreement. Not shocking at all. We should remember about his brothers. We have this event in the book of Acts, chapter 1, that happened about 6 months, little more than 6 months, actually about 7 months after the Sukkot we're talking about. So we're not talking about a long time. And this was after the resurrection. The disciples, including Yeshua's brothers, his family, watched him ascend up into the sky. Then after that, they all returned to Jerusalem together, and they were gathered together there. It tells us who was there in that upper room at this time. Now realize the Holy Spirit had not yet been poured out upon them. It says they went up into the upper room where they were staying. That is Peter, John, Jacob, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, Jacob, the son of Halphi, Simon the Zealot, and Judah, the son of Jacob. That's the 12 apostles, so actually 11 at that time. All these, with one accord, continued steadfastly in prayer and supplication, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and with his brothers. So it's pretty clear that the disciples and Yeshua's family are all in one accord together praying after they saw this. Clearly, they're believers. And as we go along, in the scriptures, we find the books of James and Jude. These are Yeshua's brothers, Bible writers. And of course, James was the leader of the Nazarene movement that was headquartered in Jerusalem. So I think it's a misreading of things to say that his family were not believers. So we have this conundrum again that people have trouble with. How could the disciples and Yeshua's family believe in him while not believing everything he said? And the reason is there are different levels of belief. It's interesting, Yeshua, when teaching, mentions how Yahweh takes care of everybody, how he even clothes the grass of the field, the birds, and so on. And he says, why don't you believe that he'll take care of you, you of little faith? See, it's possible to have just a little faith. Don't put down a little faith. Because Yeshua said if you have faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you can say to this sycamore tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Even a little faith has power. That might be the faith that people have when they first come to faith in Yeshua as Lord. They put faith in that. But when they do they have faith in everything that he said? They probably don't even know and understand everything that he said. Now, here we have an example of levels of faith. This is in Numbers 11. And we find in Numbers 11 that early in Moses' ministry, Yeshua said things to Moses that even Moses couldn't believe. And basically what Yeshua said is he was going to feed the whole nation of Israel for a month. So much meat that they couldn't even stand it anymore. So Moses is responding to what Yahweh had said. Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 men on foot, and you've said, I will give them flesh that they may eat a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? And Yahweh said to Moses, has Yahweh's hand grown short? Now you will see whether my word will happen to you or not. Guess what Moses saw happen? That's what builds faith. When you actually walk with Yahweh, you will have doubts. He will tell you things, and you're going to think, how could that possibly happen? And then you'll be shocked when it happens. And when you see this happen enough times, your faith increases. This experience with him over time increases your faith until you get to the place that, if he tells you something that nobody else would believe, you'll believe it because you have this experience with him. This is what happened to Moses. As Moses walked with Yahweh and saw him always keep his word, even when it seemed totally outrageous, he still kept his word. Moses came to believe every word. Every word. He didn't have to know how it was going to happen. He got to the place where he stopped asking the questions, like, Lord, how is that going to happen? He didn't say that anymore. He didn't know how it would happen, except that Yahweh said it, so it would happen. Well, it's great to have a strong faith, but it's even better to have a perfect faith. That's the highest level of faith, a perfect faith. Now, I'm sure we all would realize that Yeshua had perfect faith. But it's hard to think that imperfect people could have perfect faith. And we are imperfect. And yet, it is possible to grow to a place where you have perfect faith. That can happen. I think our example of someone who's an imperfect person with a perfect faith would have to be Abraham, wouldn't it? Yahweh tested him, tested his faith, until Abraham got to the place that whatever Yahweh said or required of him, Abraham believed him and would do it. That's what perfect faith is. Deuteronomy 18:13 says, you shall be perfect with Yahweh, your Elohim. It's talking about perfect faith, commanding us to have perfect faith. It wouldn't command you to have perfect faith unless it's possible. Proverbs 4:18, but the path of the righteous is like the dawning light that shines more and more until the perfect day. That's how it works. As you move along with Yahweh, as you get to know His Word better and better, it's like the dawning light. It keeps getting brighter and brighter. Your faith keeps increasing until it's the perfect day. It's fully surrounded in light. Job 13:15, I like how the King James Version puts it. Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. I believe that's perfect faith. That, by the way, is the faith of Yeshua Messiah, right? Because he knew. It was the Father's will to slay him. And yet, he trusted in him. What an amazing example of perfect faith. Do you know that there were others that followed Yeshua that had the same faith? Paul knew the end that he was going to come to, and some in Ephesus tried to prevent him from putting himself in the situation where those things would happen. And yet, knowing it would lead to his death, he went forward, knowing it was the will of his Father. He continued to trust him, even knowing how things would end up. That's a perfect faith. Well, it takes a while to develop a perfect faith, unless it's just given to you as a gift, which is a different thing. There is a spiritual gift of faith that some people are just gifted with. Most of us don't get it like that. Most of us have to go through that process like Moses did. So, let's say you don't have perfect faith yet, which most of us don't. Your faith is mixed with some unbelief. What can you do about that? Well, we have the man with a demon-possessed son who came to Yeshua. And Yeshua said, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately, the father of the child cried out with tears, I believe. Help my unbelief. Remember that prayer. Yeshua honored that prayer for that man, and he will honor it for you. Don't be discouraged if your faith is not yet as strong as it could be. Ask Yeshua for more faith. Hebrews 12:2, looking to Yeshua, the author and perfecter of your faith. See, that's talking about this process. Yeshua is working in you right now. He is leading you in your life to perfect your faith. That's his desire, to bring you to that place where you too have a perfect faith. Strangely, some of us doubt that could ever happen with us, right? Which is only an evidence that we haven't reached a perfect faith yet, because the scripture is telling us this is who Yeshua is, that he wants to bring us to that place. He is the perfecter of our faith, as well as being the perfect example. Here's something else to remember about building faith. Hearing the truth builds faith. So just, for example, being at our meeting and doing that every week, following along in these scriptures, this builds faith. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Elohim. Now, of course, spending time in the scriptures yourself, like Ginny was modeling for her daughter, builds faith. And you will find that the more you focus your life and attention on his truth, the greater your faith becomes. This is how we feed our faith. Our faith needs to be fed to grow. Well, now we're going to move on and just look at a few other things in John 7 and just kind of observe people at different levels of belief and unbelief. And we have opinions that varied a great deal when Yeshua did go to Jerusalem on that Sukkot. There was much murmuring among the multitudes concerning him. Some said he is a good man. Others said, not so, but he leads the multitude astray. That's about how it goes, isn't it? On almost everything of a spiritual nature. You have some people who genuinely feel favorable, and then you have other people who think, oh, this is a deception, maybe thinking this is a deception too. Because especially in these days, people are very cynical about things, and particularly things they perceive as being religious. A lot of people have gotten to a place where they think it's all just bunk, right? So these are opinions today, and they were opinions back then. And here's another opinion. Yeshua accused the leaders of seeking to kill him, saying, why do you seek to kill me? The multitude answered, you have a demon. Who seeks to kill you? In other words, the multitude, and these are probably the multitude that were there for Sukkot from Galilee and outlying regions. They know nothing of any kind of plot to kill Messiah. So they think he doesn't know what he's talking about. They say he has a demon because in their mind there is no such plot of anybody trying to kill him. Perhaps he's got some kind of conspiracy theory going or something. That's what they think. Can you imagine people like this today thinking this? You know, I had a video recently, which you should watch, that was essentially called Building the Beast. It's all about the things going on in the world to bring us to a whole new place in the history of all mankind. Not a good place. Events that will bring us to the Great Tribulation. Some people could look at that information and say exactly the same thing. You must have a demon. This is crazy to think this. A lot of people don't think that things can change that much, even though the scriptures say they will. You know, it's interesting, there's a lot of people who are believers that say, oh, I don't read prophecy because I really don't believe in that. Prophecy's in the scriptures. God said it. And they don't believe in it. This is not an unusual attitude. However, we have people who had exactly the opposite attitude about the plot. And that came from the people that lived in Jerusalem. It says, therefore, some of them of Jerusalem said, isn't this he whom they seek to kill? So the people from the outlying areas, to them, this was an outrageous idea. To the people that lived there in the city of Jerusalem, it's common knowledge. They all know it. And that rings true because in the city, people have a lot of personal connections with one another. And so this kind of thing gets around. And they said, behold, he speaks openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the rulers indeed know that this is truly the Messiah? Well, these people, they're observing this. They're seeing how the religious leaders are behaving, and they're seeing how Yeshua is behaving, and they're thinking, well, maybe the rulers aren't acting because this really is the Messiah. You know, this kind of questioning can lead a person to faith. Encourage this. because this is people actually thinking about things. That's a good thing. And going on a little farther, John 7:31, but of the multitude, many believed in him. They said, when the Messiah comes, he won't do more signs than those which this man has done, will he? They believed it. They believed the signs. They believed what they saw him do. They believed his amazing teachings. They believed that he was the Messiah. They specifically are talking about the Messiah. And this is a problem, I think, for people who say that Yeshua is not the Messiah. How are they going to explain the things he did if he wasn't the Messiah? By what power did he raise people from the dead? By what power did he himself be raised from the dead? By what power did he heal everybody that came to him needing healing, no matter what their problem? Did he cast out demons from every person who had them, who came to him, and do miracles like walking on water and feeding the 5,000? I mean, if he wasn't the Messiah, how do you explain that he did those things? Was he an alien from outer space that had special technology? Some people think stuff like this. The most recent thing I saw is he was actually educated by the Buddhists, as if the Buddhists could do this. Have you ever seen a Buddhist do any of this? But somehow that's an explanation. It's crazy. So what these people did is what we would encourage anyone to do. Judge by the observable facts of what is actually happening with people. Don't be fooled by things people say. Look at what they're actually doing. That will lead you to Yeshua Messiah and his truth. Now we want to look a little bit at how Yeshua dealt with unbelief. We saw this story about his brothers, and we had seen that this was kind of an issue going on at the time. It wasn't just his brothers, it was the disciples too. And Yeshua knew they didn't accept what he said. But in the end, he explained what his position was, whether they accepted it or not, and he didn't go with them. Faith does not follow unbelief. Sometimes we can be following the leading of Yeshua in a certain matter. And one of the brothers or sisters might have a concern. And under certain circumstances, it might be something that's a reasonable concern. It's like these brothers here. We always go to Sukkot every year. The scriptures tell us to. You shouldn't let this thing interfere with going to Sukkot. Is that not a perfectly logical thing for them to think? We have brothers and sisters sometimes that, they think a certain thing that disagrees with what Yeshua is actually doing. So what are we going to do in this ministry when there's some people that disagree, honestly disagree, like Yeshua's brothers did, and yet Yahweh is saying, go this way? Well, we're going to still love them, but we're going to go this way. That's what we're going to do. That's what Yeshua did. That's what we need to do. We need to do the Father's will first of all. And then, he will work it out with people and help them to see. And as things work out, it becomes evident what the truth is, what is his will. With Yeshua, he didn't go with his brothers. And what happened after this shows us why. Because his brothers went to Sukkot, and everybody is looking for Yeshua with his brothers. So let's just say that the religious leaders had planned a plot against Yeshua They knew that he would be coming with his brothers. They were looking for his brothers. What could have happened to Yeshua's brothers? They could have been embroiled in this whole thing unnecessarily, right? So Yeshua wasn't going to put them in that kind of position, or even so that they would think he did. And so he went later in secret. And this also prevented any premature attempt against him. His time had not yet come. He was acting in accord with that. So basically what we see, what he did, is he ignored well-meaning advice that was not the will of God. From people he loved. That will not always be received well. But what else can you do if you're in the same situation and you know the will of God? You know, we have this thing, this dichotomy facing us constantly when we walk in faith with Yeshua. Will I do what Yeshua's telling me to do, or am I going to do what these people I care about want me to do? And this is like all the time. You know, we over and over again, we face this. So I think this example of Yeshua is important for us to realize we really must put the Father's will first in our life. Then with some of these other things, look at how Yeshua dealt with the unbelief among the crowd. We have this statement, when it was now the midst of the feast, Yeshua went up into the temple and taught. The Judeans therefore marveled, saying, how does this man know letters, having never been educated? You see, this kind of a thing that the people were noticing about Yeshua, this is the kind of a thing that opens up the truth to people. Things that don't make sense unless it's God. You see, how could Yeshua, who obviously did not go to their schools, all right? He was not a seminarian. How did he know letters? Is it true that he was not educated? That's not true at all. When these people say educated, they mean by them, in their schools. If he had been educated in their schools, first of all, he wouldn't have been Yeshua. But if that had happened, then he would simply be another rabbi you never heard of, who said the same things all the other rabbis said. That's who he would be. Look at what happens when people go to Christian seminaries. Do any of them ever have an original idea? Those people that go to the seminaries, and I don't really mean to be putting them down, but the truth is, they are rehashing stuff that people learned 300 years ago. Shouldn't there be fresh revelation? Shouldn't there always be fresh revelation? You're not going to get it going to a seminary or like any kind of school of religion. Yeshua got his education as a man from his family, from the Word, the Scriptures. He knew what they said better than anybody, and of course, from his Father in heaven. That's the principal source of his education, even though some of it could have come through these other ways. Just think of a little baby, Yeshua, on his mother's knee, like little Kezi on Ginny's knee, looking into the Word of God, speaking about the truth. This is how Yahweh educates his people. It's them having a heart's desire to know the truth and digging into the truth. Don't ever underestimate that. The world does. The world totally underestimates that. They will choose a man who has a lot of letters after his name before the anointed preacher any day of the week. In this world, even the believers are brainwashed to look to the system as to what is true and what isn't. That's what this is about. And yet, what they saw with Yeshua is when he's teaching in the temple, he is running circles around all of these people who were educated. He knows the scriptures frontwards, backwards, up and down better than they ever did. The reason is their heads are filled with religious dogma, not understanding of the word itself. Yeshua explained this to the people, helping to lead some to faith, the fact that they had this question. He says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone desires to do his will, he will know about the teaching, whether it is from Elohim or if I am speaking from myself." Well, then he also gives another clue. He says, "He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him." These statements appeal to honest-hearted people. They know if he was not educated in the schools of the religious elite, and yet he is able to totally refute them in his teaching, what other explanation is there except this is from God? Yeshua is pointing this out to them. And then this other thing about seeking glory. They know who these religious leaders are and that they're all seeking their own glory. They can recognize this, that that's not what Yeshua is after. And who would you believe? Someone who is seeking their own glory or someone who is seeking the glory of the Father? Honest-hearted people can see that. Well, here's another thing. However, we know where this man comes from, but when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he comes from. Now, I believe this isn't those same people talking. I think this is punctuated wrong, and that this is actually the religious leaders talking. This was their opinion. And basically, what this is what we call a red herring, something drawn across the path to throw people off, because there's nothing in the scriptures that even say this. For example, in Matthew, they knew that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So even on an earthly basis, it was known where the Messiah would come from. And so this is entirely a religious lie. And when you see a religious lie, you need to know it came from religious leaders. That's where it came from. So here's what Yeshua taught in the temple on the basis of this. He says, "You both know me and know where I am from. I've not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you don't know. I know him because I'm from him, and he sent me." He is calling them out for being disingenuous. They have seen his signs. There's no place else where he could have come from. than from the Father. All of this he did before the people, leading them to faith. Yeshua is a challenge. Not only believing in him in the first place, which I don't find hard to do. I think anybody that really has an honest heart and spends time just reading the Gospels and thinking about it and praying about it has to come to the conclusion that Yeshua is the Messiah. There's no other reasonable explanation for him. I don't think it's hard to come to that conclusion. But his words and his actions are hard to do. They go against our fallen human nature. They take amazing courage. And sometimes they don't seem to make sense to people. Like loving your enemies, for example. That just doesn't make sense to people. And yet, if you do it, you see good fruit from it. Yeshua is amazing. And the fact that he knew who he was, knew what the truth is, and always acted according to the truth and his Father's will, regardless of what anybody else ever did, is an absolute proof that what he claimed to be true is true, that he was doing what his Father told him to do. Because there's no other way that anybody could have the strength to do what he did, except by the strength of Yahweh to do it. Human beings just don't have that kind of strength to be able to essentially stand up to the entire world. He did that. Well, all of this shows us that there is a higher level of faith, and I think I just would like to close with Philippians 3:12 through 14. And this is Paul. Now, we already talked about how things ended up with Paul, and I think any of us would be very happy to have Paul's faith, someone with an amazing testimony of faith. But he didn't claim that he had made it to that highest level we're talking about. He says, not that I've already obtained or am already made perfect, but I press on, if it is so that I may take hold of that for which also I was taken hold of by Messiah Yeshua. This is what we must do, is press on, whatever level of faith we may be at right now. Don't let that discourage you if it's not where you want to be. Press on to a higher level. He says, brothers, I don't regard myself as yet having taken hold, but one thing I do, forgetting the things which are behind and stretching forward to the things which are before, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the high calling of Elohim in Messiah Yeshua. There's so much in this, and I could do a whole teaching on this, but I love the fact that he says, forgetting the things which are behind. That's what's the faith killer, friends. If you stay mired in the things of the past, that is like an anchor to this world that holds you back in your faith. Whatever happened in the past, that's over. If it's an issue still, deal with it with Yeshua and let it go, because that's what he wants to do. We have to get to a place where we can do this. Stop holding grudges against people. Stop holding grudges against ourselves. Maybe you had a big failure in your life. Big deal. A lot of people fail. Get up, dust yourself off, ask for Yahweh's forgiveness, and then believe him that he forgives you in the name of Yeshua. And move on from that place. Don't let the past bog you down so that you can't move on to that next level. That's what Paul's talking about. So instead of being bogged down in the past, stretch forward to the things that are before you. That's what matters. Yeshua has things for you. You can climb that ladder of faith. You can move to that higher level, closer to him, closer to the prize that he's holding before you. And in the end, it can be yours. Make that the first thing in your life, and you will move to a higher level of faith.
Was this video informative? Remember to hit the like button to help spread the word, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications button so you'll get updates on all the great content coming from Eliyahu Ben David.
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You know, the apostles, they were Torah scholars. This is why I'm doing Zion Academy. The lessons include 2-hour audio programs and quiz modules. All the lessons in the Torah can be applied to us today. Not to mention, they open up the renewed covenant scriptures in a whole new level, much like the apostles had understanding of the Torah. Plus, I can do the courses in my own time, at my own pace, with no prerequisites, and at a very low cost. I can do them here. Or here.
Zion Academy students are provided with study materials, the Zion Messianic Scriptures, in-depth verse-by-verse programs, and quizzes with your final grade and a certificate at the end of the course. Zion Academy also offers assignments for students who would like to opt in to take part in the Zion Tabernacle live Shabbat meetings. Become immersed in the Torah. Find out how you can become a Zion Academy student at zion.org.